In the deserts of Iraq in 1991, long before American troops ever reached the ground, something far more frightening began to spread through Iraqi armored units, and it was not a new bomb, not a secret missile, and not even a new kind of aircraft that they could clearly see, but a sound, a strange mechanical roar that cut through the sky like a chainsaw, and once you heard it, you knew something terrible was about to happen, because that sound meant that somewhere above you, a U.S. Air Force A-10 Warthog was already lining you up as its next target, and for many tank crews, hearing it was enough to make them abandon their vehicles and run for their lives. The A-10 was not designed to look beautiful, fast, or elegant like the sleek fighter jets people imagine when they think of air power, because it was designed for one thing and one thing only, to hunt and destroy enemy forces on the ground, especially tanks, armored vehicles, and anything that threatened American troops, and every part of its strange, almost ugly shape reflected that brutal purpose. From its wide straight wings that let it fly slow and low, to its armored cockpit that could survive direct hits, to the massive cannon mounted in its nose, which was so large that the entire plane was essentially built around it like a gun with wings. By the time Operation Desert Storm began, Iraq had one of the largest tank forces in the world, with thousands of armored vehicles spread across the desert, dug into defensive positions, and ready to meet any invasion from the ground, and on paper, this should have made them extremely dangerous, because tanks dominate open terrain, and the Iraqi military expected to fight a conventional war where their armor would play a central role, but what they were not prepared for was an American aircraft. Designed specifically to turn tank warfare into a nightmare, and that aircraft was already warming up its engines far away, waiting for the moment when it would be unleashed. When the war started, Iraqi armored columns began to move, spreading out across roads, deserts, and defensive lines, believing that their thick steel armor would protect them from most threats, but above them, American surveillance aircraft, satellites, and forward observers were tracking every movement, and feeding that information directly to squadrons of A-10 pilots who were getting ready to go hunting. And unlike high-altitude bombers or fast jet fighters, these pilots would be flying straight into the danger zone, down where they could see individual vehicles, individual soldiers, and individual targets, turning the battlefield into something personal and terrifying. What made the A-10 so different from anything Iraqi forces had faced before was not just its firepower, but how it fought, because instead of making one quick pass and fleeing, the Warthog would circle its prey, attacking again and again, chewing through armor, destroying vehicles, and spreading panic across entire units, and this persistence meant that once an A-10 found you, it was not going away until either you were destroyed or it was, and that simple fact alone was enough to shatter morale before a single round was fired. And then there was the sound, that unforgettable growl of its engines combined with the terrifying roar of its main gun, a noise that did not sound like a bomb or a missile but like a mechanical beast tearing the air apart, and soldiers on the ground quickly learned to associate that sound with instant destruction, because when the A-10 opened fire, its 30mm cannon could rip through tank armor, explode vehicles, and turn entire columns into burning wrecks in just seconds, and the more this happened, the more that sound became a signal of doom across the desert. This is where our story really begins, not with a battle map or a political decision, but with fear, because once fear spreads, it changes how people fight, how they think, and whether they even want to stay and fight at all, and in the case of the A-10 Warthog, fear would become one of its most powerful weapons, reshaping the battlefield long before American ground troops ever arrived, and in the next part, we are going to dive into the machine itself, how it was built, why it looks the way it does, and why it was perfectly designed to become the ultimate tank killer. So if you're enjoying this so far and you love stories about the machines that changed history, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because this is just the beginning of how one strange-looking jet made entire armored units lose their nerve in the middle of a war. To understand why the A-10 inspired so much fear on the battlefield, you have to understand that it was never meant to be just another airplane, because from the very first sketches on a designer's desk, it was built around a single terrifying idea, which was that its main weapon, a gigantic 30mm cannon known as the GAU-8 Avenger, would be the center of everything. And instead of adding a gun to a plane, the engineers essentially built a plane around a gun, creating a flying weapon. platform that existed for the sole purpose of tearing apart tanks, armored vehicles, and anything that stood in the way of American troops on the ground. This cannon was not a normal aircraft gun, because it was more like a small artillery piece mounted inside the nose of a jet, capable of firing thousands of rounds per minute, each one a heavy, armor-piercing shell designed to punch through steel, explode inside a vehicle, and turn it into a burning wreck, and when the GAU-8 fired, it produced a sound so loud and so violent that it became legendary among soldiers on both sides. A deep, ripping roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And once you heard it, you did not need to look up to know that something horrible was happening. To make this weapon truly effective, the A-10 had to be able to get close to the ground, slow down, and stay over the battlefield long enough to find and destroy targets, which is why it had those wide straight wings that gave it incredible lift and control at low speeds, allowing it to fly just a few hundred feet above the ground while still being stable and precise, and this meant A-10 pilots could actually see what they were shooting at, rather than relying entirely on instruments or long-range sensors, turning every mission into a brutal form of close combat between machine and machine. The cockpit of the A-10 was another clue to its brutal role, because it was surrounded by a thick titanium bathtub that protected the pilot from ground fire, meaning that even if the plane was hit by bullets or shrapnel, the person inside could keep flying and fighting, and this level of protection was almost unheard of for a jet aircraft, but it was necessary, because the Warthog was designed to go where the danger was greatest, flying straight into areas filled with anti-aircraft guns, small arms fire, and missiles, all so it could get close enough to deliver its devastating attacks. When you combine this rugged design with the sheer firepower of the GAU-8, you get an aircraft that behaves less like a traditional jet and more like a flying tank, one that can take hits, keep going, and continue attacking until its mission is complete, and this is exactly what Iraqi armored crews were about to face in the deserts of Kuwait and southern Iraq, because once the A-10 entered the fight, their thick steel armor was no longer the shield they believed it to be. As we move forward, we are going to see how this gun with wings was unleashed in Desert Storm, how it hunted Iraqi tanks across the sand, and why its presence alone was sometimes enough to break entire units without a single American soldier ever having to fire a shot on the ground. So stay with us, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to keep hearing these incredible stories of technology, warfare, and the machines that made enemies panic. When the air war over Iraq and Kuwait reached full intensity, the A-10 Warthog was finally given the mission it had been built for, because while fast jets and bombers were striking airfields, radar stations, and command centers, the Warthogs were sent low and slow into the vast deserts where Iraqi tanks and armored vehicles were spread out, hiding in dug-in positions, moving along highways, and forming defensive lines. And this created a deadly game of cat and mouse in which one side had heavy armor and the other had an aircraft designed specifically to tear that armor apart. A-10 pilots flew their missions at altitudes so low that they could make out individual vehicles, road markings, and even the shapes of troops on the ground, and this meant that they were not just attacking general areas, they were hunting specific targets, selecting which tank to destroy first, which vehicle to disable next, and how to attack a column in a way that would cause maximum chaos, because in armored warfare, destroying just a few key vehicles can block roads, trap entire units, and turn an organized formation into a tangled, vulnerable mess. Once a target was identified, the A-10 would line up for a firing run, diving slightly to point its massive cannon directly at the enemy, and then the pilot would squeeze the trigger, unleashing a stream of armor-piercing rounds that traveled so fast and hit so hard that they could shred through the thick steel plating of Iraqi tanks, setting off ammunition, igniting fuel, and leaving nothing but twisted metal and fire in their wake. And because the Warthog could carry a huge amount of ammunition, it could repeat this process again and again, staying over the battlefield long enough to make sure the job was truly done. For Iraqi tank crews, this was a nightmare, because unlike artillery or missiles, which might strike once and then move on, the A-10 stayed, circling overhead, waiting for movement, and this meant that even trying to escape could make you a target, as the slightest shift of a vehicle or the smallest plume of dust could give away your position, and once the Warthog locked onto you, there was very little you could do to stop what was coming. As word of these attacks spread through Iraqi units, fear began to take hold, because soldiers started to realize that their tanks, which were supposed to be their greatest protection, were now drawing deadly attention from the sky, and that sometimes it was safer to be on foot than inside a burning armored vehicle, and this led to scenes that would later be reported by coalition forces, where perfectly good tanks were found abandoned in the desert, their crews having fled rather than face the terror of another A-10 pass. In the next part, we are going to dive deeper into how this fear affected Iraqi strategy, how entire formations began to break apart, and why the sound of the Warthog became a signal for panic across the battlefield. So stay tuned, and remember to hit that like button and subscribe if you want to keep following this incredible story of how one aircraft reshaped the war from the skies. As the A-10s continued their relentless hunting across the deserts, something fundamental began to change in the way Iraqi forces viewed their own equipment, because tanks and armored vehicles, which had once represented power, protection, and dominance on the battlefield, were now becoming rolling coffins, and this shift in perception was devastating, because when soldiers lose faith in the tools that are supposed to keep them alive, their willingness to fight starts to collapse from the inside out. The Warthog's attacks were not random, they were methodical, because A-10 pilots learned quickly how to strike armored columns in ways that caused maximum disruption, often targeting the lead and rear vehicles first, trapping the rest of the column in place, and then working their way inward, destroying one tank after another while the trapped crews had no easy way to escape, and from the ground. This felt less like a battle and more like an execution, because there was nowhere to go and no way to hide from a predator that could see everything from above. What made this even more terrifying was how difficult it was to fight back, because Iraqi anti-aircraft guns and missiles were designed primarily to deal with fast, high-flying jets, not a slow, low-flying aircraft that could maneuver easily and take hits without falling out of the sky, and while some A-10s were damaged during the war, the fact that so many of them returned safely despite flying straight into the danger zone only reinforced their reputation as nearly unstoppable, and that reputation traveled quickly through Iraqi ranks. Reports began to emerge of tank crews abandoning their vehicles as soon as they heard the distinctive roar of the Warthog approaching, choosing to run and hide rather than stay inside a machine that had become a magnet for destruction, and while this might seem unbelievable, it makes perfect sense when you realize that being inside a tank targeted by an A-10 often meant being trapped in a steel box as armor-piercing rounds ripped through it, turning it into a furnace of fire and shrapnel, and no amount of training can completely override the instinct to survive when faced with that kind of horror. From the American side, this effect was both dramatic and incredibly valuable, because every tank that was abandoned or destroyed by the A-10 was one less threat to US and Allied troops on the ground, and that meant fewer firefights, fewer casualties, and a faster collapse of Iraqi resistance. And all of this was being driven by a single aircraft that combined brutal firepower with a terrifying presence over the battlefield. In the next part, we are going to look at specific encounters, stories from pilots and soldiers, and moments when the A-10's impact was felt most strongly, so stay with us, and if you're enjoying this story, make sure to like the video and subscribe, because there is much more to come. As the ground war drew closer and Iraqi units became more desperate to hold their positions, the A-10's presence over the battlefield grew even more intense, because now it was not just hunting isolated tanks or scattered vehicles, it was actively shaping the outcome of entire engagements, and pilots began to accumulate stories that sounded almost unreal. Moments when they would arrive over a stretch of desert and find long lines of destroyed or abandoned armored vehicles stretching out beneath them like a graveyard of steel, silent proof of how devastating their aircraft had become. One A-10 pilot later described flying over a highway and seeing dozens of Iraqi vehicles in various states of destruction, some burning, some riddled with holes, and some simply sitting there empty, as if their crews had vanished into thin air, and what struck him most was not just the physical damage, but the feeling that the enemy had simply given up, because in many cases there were no bodies nearby. No signs of last stands, just open hatches and discarded equipment, showing that the sound and reputation of the Warthog had been enough to break their will to fight. On the ground, coalition troops advancing through these areas were stunned by what they found, because they expected fierce resistance from armored units that had been dug in for months, but instead they often encountered deserted positions, disabled tanks, and vehicles left behind in the sand, and this made their advance far easier and far less deadly than anyone had predicted, all thanks to the work that had already been done by the A-10s in the air, softening and sometimes completely collapsing Iraqi defenses before ground troops ever arrived. These scenes also had a powerful psychological effect on American and Allied forces, because seeing the remains of what the A-10 had done gave them confidence, the kind of confidence that comes from knowing that the enemy's strongest weapons had already been neutralized, and that confidence is a force multiplier in its own right, making soldiers more willing to push forward and take risks, knowing that they had overwhelming air support watching over them. The reputation of the Warthog spread quickly through Iraqi ranks as well, because even units that had not yet been attacked had heard the stories, had seen the wreckage, and had learned what that terrifying sound in the sky meant, and this kind of reputation is incredibly powerful in war, because it turns a machine into a legend, and legends can be just as effective at destroying morale as bombs and bullets. In the next part, we are going to step back and look at how the A-10 fit into the larger strategy of Desert Storm, and why its unique role made it one of the most important weapons of the entire conflict. So if you're hooked on this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe, because we're getting closer to the big picture now. By the time coalition ground forces finally moved in during the famous 100-hour ground campaign, much of the work had already been done from the air, and the A-10 Warthog was one of the biggest reasons why, because Iraqi armored units, which were supposed to be the backbone of their defense, had been systematically hunted, scattered, and in many cases psychologically shattered long before they ever had a chance to engage American troops in a traditional battle, and this meant that what could have been a bloody and prolonged fight turned into a rapid collapse across large sections of the front. The A-10's ability to loiter over the battlefield, respond quickly to requests for help, and strike targets with devastating precision made it an ideal partner for ground forces, because whenever U.S. or Allied troops encountered resistance, Warthogs could be called in to deal with it, often within minutes, and when they arrived, their presence alone was enough to change the balance of power, as Iraqi units that might have been willing to fight tanks and infantry suddenly found themselves facing a flying gun platform that could tear them apart from above. This close relationship between air and ground forces was one of the defining features of Desert Storm, and the A-10 was at the center of it, because it was not just destroying equipment, it was protecting lives, reducing the need for risky assaults, and giving soldiers on the ground the confidence to advance, knowing that if things went wrong, a Warthog could appear overhead and unleash hell on whatever threat they were facing. From a strategic perspective, this made the A-10 incredibly valuable, because it turned air superiority into something that could be felt directly by individual soldiers and units, not just something that existed in the abstract, and this connection between the skies and the ground was a major factor in how quickly and decisively the war was won. In the final part, we are going to look at what the A-10's performance in Desert Storm meant for its legacy, how it became one of the most beloved and respected aircraft in the U.S. military, and why its terrifying sound is still remembered decades later. So stay with us, and make sure you like and subscribe if you want to keep hearing stories about the machines that made enemies panic. When the Gulf War came to an end, the deserts of Kuwait and southern Iraq were left littered with the remains of what had once been one of the largest armored forces in the world, and among the twisted wrecks and abandoned vehicles, the story of the A-10 Warthog was written in steel and fire, because this strange, rugged, almost ugly aircraft had proven that raw, focused power, combined with the right design and the right strategy, could completely rewrite the rules of the battlefield, turning tanks from symbols of strength into symbols of vulnerability. For American pilots and ground troops, the A-10 became something more than just a piece of equipment, it became a guardian, a machine they trusted with their lives, because when things went wrong on the ground, the sound of a Warthog approaching meant help was on the way, and that sound, which had caused so much terror among Iraqi forces, became a source of comfort and confidence for those it was designed to protect, showing how the same machine can inspire fear in one group and hope in another. The legacy of the A-10 did not end in Desert Storm, because the lessons learned there would go on to shape how close air support was used in future conflicts, and the reputation it earned in the deserts of the Middle East would follow it for decades, making it one of the most iconic and respected aircraft in the U.S. Air Force, and all of this began with a simple but powerful truth, that sometimes the most effective weapon is not the fastest or the most advanced, but the one that is built to do one job better than anything else in the world. And that brings us back to the heart of this episode of the machines that made enemies panic, because the A-10 Warthog did not just destroy tanks, it destroyed the enemy's belief that those tanks could keep them safe, and when that belief was gone, the battle was already half won. So if you enjoyed this story and you want to hear more about the machines that changed history and terrified their enemies, make sure you hit that like button. Leave a comment with which machine we should cover next. And subscribe to the channel, because there are many more incredible stories waiting just beyond the horizon.